All right, let's get the show on the road. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the first DGT webinar. I miss seeing everybody and enjoying all the delicious food at the kettle. But we have to be creative in times like these, and so we're presenting our very first webinar with Steve Diamond, candidate for Board of Supervisors. Good morning, Stephen.
Morning, Larry. Good morning, everyone else. Well, afternoon now. Good afternoon, everybody.
That's right. It's afternoon now. Just want to let everybody know I've set up a bunch of resources for DGT, and I want to send a special shout out to all board members I work with for your support and help. We have started, actually, we've had an informative weekly newsletter for some time. If you're not getting it, go to this web address. It's tiny.cc/DGT news, as you can see. Well, hello, Kathy. Good morning and welcome. We also have a newly redesigned website with lots of information and articles that you won't see anywhere else. And just go to thedgt.org. And we have a podcast of speakers that we had earlier this year. And you just go to tiny.cc/DGT. And we have a list of our upcoming speakers. Just go to thedgt.org and click on the events button, and you will see who we have lined up. But back to business today. I want to introduce Steve. He's the first Democrat to run in District 4 since 1996. Steve is a lifelong Democrat, and he's a pragmatic guy. He's not ideological when it comes to Democratic politics. He's a second-generation descendant from refugees. He was originally from New York City, and he's lived in Pima County for 50 years. So that's since 1971. He's a 1976 grad of the U of A School of Music. I asked him what instrument he plays, and he said he sings. So someday I want a private concert, Steve.
Okay.
Steve has a 40-year career in information technology, and it's a good thing because everything's going online these days, and he's well suited to administer the county's $1.3 billion budget. So, Steve, take it away.
Thanks a lot, Larry. Well, I must begin today with acknowledging the untimely death of the wonderful public servant and longtime Pima County Supervisor, Richard Elias, whom I counted as a friend and a mentor. His death on Saturday was most unexpected and has hit people very hard. I know. Well, it's hit me hard anyway. There's a story behind this cartoon, which seems relatively straightforward, but for anyone who, oh, did we lose that slide, Larry?
Yep, we've got it back now.
Thanks. For anyone who didn't haunt the Board of Supervisors meetings for the last few years the way I've been haunting them, at the beginning of every meeting they have roll call, and Richard would always answer when his name was called. He would answer presente. And one time, about a year and a half ago, someone challenged him, one of Ali Miller's minions, who delighted in reprimanding the board pretty much every week or every meeting, got up and said, you can't just say presente. English is the official language of Arizona, and you have to use English. So Richard very graciously started saying, presente, I am present. Next slide, please. So in loving memory of Richard Elias, I would like to ask us all to observe just a moment of silence, please. Thank you. Now this cartoon from Fitz at the Daily Star, for those who, like me, have little or no Spanish, I had to look it up, but what he's saying is hugs, and there's Cesar Chavez saying, yes, we can. It's a beautiful representation, and I wanted to tell another story about Richard. He was one who supported and encouraged me in running for this office from the beginning. Back in September of last year, the only people I had really talked to about it were a couple of close friends who I blame for instigating me into doing this in the first place, and of course my partner, who was initially extremely negative about the idea, and then for some unknown reason one day she changed her mind completely and she said, Steve, I think this is the right next thing for you to do. So with her blessing, I went and I spoke with Allison Jones, the chair of Pima County Democratic Party, and Allison encouraged me strongly. She said that she had been hearing for years from groups, especially down in Green Valley, that they really needed to run a good Democratic candidate in District 4. So Allison was thrilled that I think that anyone would step forward. It didn't really matter who it was, but I don't know, I'm perhaps selling myself a little short, but Allison was very encouraging, and she's been extremely helpful. And one more story about Richard. So I had met with him several times throughout the fall, and he was always, Larry, we lost that slide again.
Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, there we go.
There it is. Richard was always very supportive, very helpful. He told me a lot of things. He vetted me. He said, do you really know what you're getting into? And I'm sure I didn't. I'm sure I still don't. I'm learning more every day about what's entailed. But after a few of these meetings, one day last December, I think it was, I called him up. I phoned him and he answered the phone, Supervisor. And I said, Richard, don't you think that's a little premature? And he said, well, it sounds good, doesn't it? So that was Richard, and I miss him terribly. I'm sure I will continue to miss him, but I take his example as the inspiration for this campaign. I can't hope to fill his shoes the way he filled them, but I really take his service, his attitude of uncompromising principle, of always speaking his mind, as really the essence of public service, with honesty, with integrity, and with a whole heart. In fact, speaking of heart, if you want to read more about him, I highly recommend the tribute that was written by Blake Morlock for the Sentinel, published over the weekend online at TucsonSentinel.com, entitled, I think it's entitled He Brought the Heart Until It Gave Out. It's a beautiful tribute. Okay. On with the show. Next slide, please. Well, covered a little bit about who I am and why I'm running, and I will start by talking about my family background. So on the next slide, this is, by the way, one thing Larry didn't cover in the housekeeping is there is a horizontal bar, I think, on everyone's screen that you can drag up and down that will either enlarge the portion of the screen that has my face on it, or enlarge the portion that has the slide on it. So if you want to adjust those, that's how to do it. This is a photo of my great-great-grandfather, Simon. He lived in a village in Romania. He was the cantor at the local synagogue. And the situation in Romania in the last decades of the 19th century was a violent one. There was violent anti-Semitism, pogroms, and actions being taken against Jews continually. And my great-great-grandfather stuck it out. I don't know anything about the later years of his life. What I know, though, is that his son, my great-grandfather, decided to leave Romania in the early 1890s, and he brought his two youngest sons to New York City. One of them was my grandfather. And he later returned to Romania, brought back his wife and some other children, and they ended up settling on New York's Lower East Side, where he raised 7 sons, no daughters. And he was active in the Jewish press. He was publisher of a Yiddish newspaper. And he was also active in the Jewish labor movement. And I'm going to return to the labor movement a little bit later. But for his 7 sons, he had high hopes and high ambitions. And sure enough, they turned out all to be professional men, doctors, lawyers, dentists, businessmen of one kind or another. And my grandfather, who had come across at the age of 2, I think, was a lawyer, as was my father, a lawyer. So these professional opportunities were open to immigrants at that time. And I think the times have changed so that it is considerably more difficult these days for immigrants to take advantage of those kinds of opportunities that were open to my ancestors, to my grandfather, to my great uncles. But because of that experience, because of knowing that family history, I have such a place in my heart for immigrants, and I could not possibly advocate for that door to be closed to those opportunities. It would be the essence of hypocrisy for me to try to do that. So that is a core value that I certainly hold. As for me, I moved to Tucson in 1971, and I studied at the University of Arizona, College of Fine Arts, School of Music. I got the Bachelor of Music degree in 1976 in voice, as Larry said. I used to sing in the choirs. I have also sung in the Tucson Symphony Orchestra choir, did that for several years, and numerous performances of Handel's Messiah, among other things. And I had the 40-year career in information technology. Now, the reason why I say that that suits me well to help run the county is that I learned to understand large, complex business operations. And the county, certainly the county government, is a large, complex business operation. So I think I have a head start in that, being able to grasp that kind of operation. On the other hand, it's a good thing that the individual supervisors don't need to understand all the intricate details, that we have staff for that, and also, of course, the entire administrative staff, including the county administrator, Mr. Huckleberry, who take care of keeping track of all those details so that the supervisors don't have to My political involvement, before I left New York, I was kind of a hippie radical activist. I went to a few anti-war marches on Washington in the late 1960s, but I wasn't all that active politically after moving to Tucson until 2016. And as many of you in the audience, I'm sure, I was galvanized by the result of the 2016 election. I joined a local Indivisible chapter. I became co-leader of that. And one of the things we discovered was that it was much more direct and easy to influence local politicians than it was to influence politicians at the national level. Office holders, elected officials at the national level have so many lobbyists, constituents, and other forces acting on them, whereas office holders at the local level are much more likely to have time and interest to speak to their constituents, to speak to citizen lobbyists, as opposed to, or in addition to, commercial lobbyists. So we started doing that kind of lobbying activity, and as a result, I got involved in going to Board of Supervisors meetings, and I got hooked. So it eventually dawned on me that I could have a much bigger platform and more influence as a supervisor myself than I could by talking to the supervisors. I had a good relationship with Richard, as I've told you, and also with the other two Democrats on the board, Sharon Bronson and Ramon Valadez. But I felt that my voice as a holder of democratic values, as a holder of community values, family values, human values, wasn't always getting heard as loudly as I would have liked to have gotten heard. And so here I am running for a seat on the board. Okay, next slide, please, Larry. So now I'll talk about some of the issues that I feel are particularly important for the county. And I don't pretend to know everything there is to know about these things. Again, that's partly why there's an administrative staff, and I have a lot of studying to do. But I would say at top of the list is ensuring a sustainable water supply. If we can't sustain the water supply for ourselves and our children and our children's children here in Pima County, then there will be no human settlements in Pima County. We all depend on the water. And we have a good start in that we're part of what they call an active management area for water use. But the projections aren't all that great. There is a gap between the supply and the demand, and no one really knows how to manage that gap at that point. I think there is more that we can be doing. The county already does quite a lot in terms of water reclamation, flood control, along with reclamation projects and regulations designed to encourage reclamation and recharging of the aquifer. But we're going to need to be doing a lot more if we're going to cover that gap between supply and demand. And so that's one of the areas that I definitely look forward to finding out more about and to working on. Next slide. And that goes along with protecting the natural environment. And one reason it goes along with it is that a lot of the environmental preservation projects that the county has undertaken have to do with flood control and with water reclamation. Whenever an area is developed, there is always an eye to building building dams, building containment ponds, anything that will help keep the water in place long enough that it will sink into the aquifer and help recharge the aquifer rather than just running off or evaporating from the desert sand. So there are many county planners and engineers already engaged in that kind of work. And I think that they can do more. I would love to be able to allocate more money for them to be able to do that. And I'll get to plans for that in a few minutes. The natural environment was one of Richard's great loves, and he has been instrumental in helping the county to acquire lots of land that was originally privately held or federally held. These initiatives are not all that well known, I don't think. They've been reported in the press over the years, but I don't know that people are particularly aware. But the county has been buying up vast tracts of land in the Reddington Pass area. Several ranches are now owned by the county in the Altar Valley as well, and another large ranch near Arivaca. There are natural areas that have been developed for partially for recreation, mostly for preservation and for water reclamation, preservation of the riparian habitats. One example of that is the Cienega Creek natural area south of Tucson. If you don't know, Cienega Creek is the real name of what we call Pantano Wash when it goes through town. And there's a beautiful natural riparian area south of town that is partly open for recreation. And these tracts in the Reddington Pass area were something that Richard, I think, was especially proud of, because one of the things that he asked me in one of, I think it was the last actual sit-down meeting I had with him, he said, well, maybe we could go ahead with the plans. There are plans that have been developed but have been shelved for turning that whole area into a wildlife conservation area, water conservation, and opening parts of it for public recreation. Some of it is already open, but the comprehensive plan for the area hasn't been taken to the point where it could be. And Richard said, you know, back in 1929, the board was very forward-looking and acquired the land which is now Tucson Mountain Park, Saguaro National Park West, and Saguaro National Park East. And that was a decision by the Pima County Board of Supervisors back in 1929 to buy that land. And so more land has been acquired, and Richard's dream was that there would be a Rincon Mountain Park in the Reddington Pass area. And I share that dream. I would love to see that developed, and I would love to see it named in his memory. I think that would be a very fitting tribute. Okay, next topic. Sorry, I'm looking down because I have a printout here, but I may as well look at the screen because there it is, timely road repair. Well, road repair is the one issue that most of the people that I talk to ever talk to me about. Why aren't the roads getting repaired? Back in my activist days in 2018, one of the first things that we did was we had a meeting with Chuck Huckleberry. This was in the spring of 2018, and asked him about this. And he explained that they had 3 plans for financing road repair. Plan A was a 0.5% county sales tax. And indeed, they tried to levy a 0.5% county sales tax in, I think it was June of 2018. Unfortunately, the state of Arizona grants to each county the ability to levy a 0.5% sales tax, but only if the Board of Supervisors for that county votes for it unanimously. And with 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans on this board, that was a foregone conclusion that there would never be a unanimous vote in support of a 0.5% sales tax. Pima and Maricopa counties are the only 2 in Arizona that do not levy that 0.5% sales tax that is authorized by state law. And I think it would be a wonderful thing if we could get 5 Democrats onto the board this year and pass that 0.5% sales tax. I realize that sales taxes are regressive, and I think that measures can be built in that would help them to be less regressive. For instance, not taxing necessities, and also taking some of the revenue and giving it back to help develop disadvantaged communities, help benefit disadvantaged communities. I don't think sales tax has to be a dirty word. Plus, remember that sales taxes are also paid by visitors to the area, and we have many wonderful tourist attractions. And if the natural development I was just talking about is carried even farther, there will be more visitors to the area. So timely road repair requires funding. That was Chuck's plan A, the 0.5% sales tax. It didn't pass. Chuck's plan B was a bond issue. And you may remember, fall of 2018, there was a county bond issue on the ballot for $400 and some million, primarily for infrastructure, for road repair, and the voters did not approve it. So that was Plan B down the tubes. And Chuck's Plan C, this is, remember, way back in 2018, was the pay-as-you-go plan, or pay-go, which takes portions of recovered revenue, recovered because we're paying down previous bond issues, principally one from 1997. And as we pay it down, the payments get lower. So without raising taxes, there are additional revenues made available to the general fund that can be allocated toward roads, toward infrastructure repair. And the board did pass that plan last year. However, it's not sufficient revenue. It just isn't enough. It's great that it can be done without raising property taxes, because the voters have been pretty firm that they don't want their property taxes raised. But you can't have timely road repair without paying for it, and the pay-as-you-go plan just isn't going to raise the money fast enough to let us catch up with years and years of insufficient revenue. So what's my plan? Part one is the 0.5% sales tax. I think it's really imperative that the county be able to raise that money, because there are so many things that can be done to invest in our communities, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes too. Part two is there is pending in the state legislature, although who knows what's going to become of it this year, because the legislative session is so disrupted because of the epidemic, obviously. But there was a bill to pretty much double the gasoline tax, and that hasn't been raised since the 1990s. It certainly deserves to be raised, and that goes into a fund called HERF, the Highway Use Fund, that's supposed to be distributed to the counties. And so part of that is, let's fund the HERF better, and let's make sure they distribute it to the counties, because in the recession of 2008, what happened in Phoenix was they started saying, oh, we can't afford to distribute all these funds to the counties. We're going to keep them to ourselves for other purposes. So there are two parts to that too. It has to be, the tax has to go up, and the revenues have to come to the counties. And that will enable us to do timely road repair and so many other things. Excuse me, I'm looking ahead here for a moment. Oh yeah, well, I'm going to insert another topic here before we go on to the next one, and that is economic development in general. The county has done a lot of planning for both infrastructure improvement, expanded development of residential development outside of the current confines, and land use, and there's just been a lot of planning that's been done, and that includes planning for economic development. And I think that it can go farther. I think it can be expanded. And here's one idea that I have. This is not something that they talk about very much, if at all. The county and other large organizations in Pima County spend a lot of money. They spend a lot of money. The budget for the county, for the overall county, is $1.3 billion a year. Now, a lot of that goes to salaries, and not all of it goes to acquisitions, because a lot of it does go to salaries, but there's still a lot of money spent with outside companies. And let's make sure that as much of that as possible is spent here in the community, not hiring some. I think there's an example of a truck dealership in I don't even know where, somewhere in North Dakota, or it's not North Dakota, but somewhere far from here, for fleet acquisition for the county. That's just not something we ought to be doing. We ought to be spending our taxpayer money here in the community, where it can multiply itself. If we spend it outside the community, it doesn't multiply itself. It just flies away. So I think we can use it. We can start there. We can start using it to develop local businesses, let the county hire local businesses, encourage the university to hire more local businesses, encourage the hospitals to hire more local businesses. Any of the large organizations that spend money on the outside, encourage them to hire local businesses and to develop local business from. Larry, you've really come up with that very fast. Thank you. Encourage the development of local businesses from the ground up, and not so much bringing in the outsiders like the Amazons and the Caterpillars. They're great for the community up to a point, but they have no roots here. And so I get concerned when I see that happening, and when I see taxpayer money being spent on incentivizing those things to happen. I think that it's well conceived, it's well executed by Mr. Huckleberry and his staff, that they guarantee there's going to be a return on the investment to the Pima County taxpayers. But it still doesn't seem like that should be the only way that we can grow the economy. I think more emphasis on local development, and especially with green industries. I would love to see green industries developed locally. Okay, what was the next one was about immigrants, right? Yeah, as I said earlier, my heart is really here, and partly because it was an immigrant related issue that first got me to be an activist at the Board of Supervisors meetings. And you may recall in 2018, when the idea of Operation Stone Garden came up, the county had previously accepted the Operation Stone Garden grant, which is a federal grant, to the Pima County Sheriff's Department without question for a number of years. And then suddenly in 2018, it was questioned, and it brought out a lot of people in the community who suddenly realized what this was doing to us. What it was doing is requiring Pima County Sheriff's deputies to collaborate directly with Border Patrol officers to work under Border Patrol direction in doing certain operations. And we were able to get that canceled. We were able to refuse the grant that year, and we were able to refuse it this year. And I count that as a big victory. I know some have different feelings about it, and I respect those. I know that people are concerned about public safety, but I assure you, I've studied this pretty closely, and those grants were not the best way of assuring public safety, because when the immigrant communities know that sheriff's deputies are collaborating with Border Patrol, they are much less likely to report crimes, to cooperate with local police in helping to solve crimes. And it just isn't good for the overall community safety at all. Also under this heading is the housing of refugees at the county youth detention center. That was another controversial issue last year when the monastery was closing down. They were looking for another facility, and people were saying, well, how could you possibly think it's a good idea to house these refugees in what was a detention center, what is set up as a detention center? It's inhumane. And if you read that article by Blake Morlock that I referred to earlier, you'll see what Richard's response was to it. He was initially listening to his friends and the social justice activists who were saying that it was a bad idea. And he changed his mind because it was the only viable idea for housing the refugees and for housing them safely and for housing them in a way where they could be cared for. And so he supported it, and I supported him in supporting it. The last issue I wanted to talk about was the Rosemont Mine. And you probably know about this. What I didn't know until recently is that even though Pima County has no real power, it's in federal hands whether this permit, which is currently in litigation for the umpteenth time, ever gets granted. But Pima County lobbying against this project has been instrumental in influencing the federal government as much as it has to delay this, and I hope to stop it. If any of you isn't familiar, spend a few minutes just read the mitigation plan for Rosemont Mine, where they talk about the measures they're going to take to mitigate the water use, to mitigate the water pollution, to mitigate the air pollution. It reads like a horror story. There is no way on God's earth that those mitigation measures are going to be effective. In return for 10 to at most 15 years of economic profit coming out of that mine, which I hope never happens, we would be poisoning our water and our air for the next 1,000 years. That's what environmental scientists tell us. And it just is not worth the trade-off. So that's the end of my list of important issues. I will also mention Larry, do I have a few more minutes to
Oh yeah, sure. Go right ahead.
Great, thanks. Also in Richard's honor, I want to mention organized labor. I've been working with labor organizations since the very first days in my Indivisible chapter, and I think there's a wonderful collaboration in this community between labor activists and labor organizers and social justice activists that has been and will continue to be very fruitful. And I'm a union member myself. I'm a member of the National Writers Union, and I strongly support organized labor and the values that they hold, because the values that labor holds are the values that I hold: honesty, integrity, community, transparency, and solidarity, looking out for one another. And I feel that in these days when we can't rely on the federal government to look out for us, we can't even rely on the state government to look out for us. Look at the confusion, look at the lack of leadership, look at the poor leadership that's coming out of Washington and that's been coming out of Phoenix. And what we do still have is ourselves. We have our local communities, our families, our neighborhoods, our communities. And that's why I think that local politics is and always will be important. And that we can, for as long as it takes, we can build ourselves up, build our communities up locally so that we can huddle, we can support each other, we can sustain ourselves and be insulated to some extent anyway from the influences that try to destroy the community from the outside. So that, above all, is why I'm running, why I'm doing this, is to uphold those values and to uphold the community. And with that, I thank you, and I'll be glad to answer questions.
Terrific. We've got some questions lined up, and audience members, this is your opportunity to participate here. Take a look for the questions screen on your computer and open it up with a little right pointing arrow. You have to tap directly on it, and then you can ask a question, and I will pass this along to Steve. So at the moment, Steve, I've got a question from Michael, and he asks about defending immigrants in deportation. Do you support creation of a branch of the public defender to represent indigent immigrants in the deportation amnesty claims?
Yeah, I support that very strongly. I've seen Margot Cowan present about that initiative several times, and I support it 100%. In fact, I think it's a shame that Margot first went to the board with that idea, and she couldn't get 3 votes for it, and it was very, very unfortunate. I don't know why that happened. The Democrat who refused to vote for it was Ramon Valadez. And so her plan B was the initiative that she's currently gathering signatures for. And in some ways it's better, because if it's passed by initiative, then the board would not be able ever to cancel it. It could only be canceled by initiative again. But yeah, I support that very strongly. I think that all of the immigrants facing deportation deserve to be represented by a lawyer, and it's scandalous that that doesn't exist already.
All right, I've got another question here for you. Tell us about your stand on public education, especially early childhood education and making higher education more affordable.
Yes, thank you. Early childhood education is something that I'm actually passionate about, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so interested in seeing the 0.5% sales tax passed, because it's going to take a lot of money to fund early childhood education properly. someone brought a proposal to the board last year for a pilot program that would have covered a small fraction of the families in Pima County. And the cost of the pilot program alone was going to be $5 million a year. And the board didn't even approve that. They projected that the cost of doing it properly and covering every family that needed the service in the county was approximately $100 million a year. And that is a great deal of money, and it's only going to come from a large revenue source like that 0.5% sales tax. I don't think it's feasible to think of funding that from existing sources. And yet, studies have shown, and intuitively people know, that if you fund early childhood education, that the investment in the community is repaid 5, 6, 7-fold, because we end up with more stable community members, more productive community members, better educated community members. And it's just a good thing. It's a win-win-win situation all around, but we have to find the funding to get it started. As far as higher education, that I haven't looked into that too much myself. Of course, the state university system is under the aegis of the state, but the community college system of Pima County is also very active, and I would need to find out more about its funding. I don't know how that would work, but again, in order to cut prices for the students, we have to find more money. Thanks.
Okay. Here's an easy question. Becky wants to know if you have a website, and I believe it's votestevediamond.com. Is that right?
Yes, it is. Yeah, there you go. Votestevediamond.com. There, if you go to votestevediamond.com, you will find the donate page, which you see on your screen there. And since it's there, let me mention that there is a campaign finance reporting deadline tomorrow. It's the end of the first quarter of the year, and the more donations that I can show this quarter, even if they're very small ones, if I can show a larger list of donors, that really helps build momentum for the campaign going forward. So if you would have spent a few dollars on lunch today, I would appreciate it if you could chip into the campaign fund. That would be wonderful. You will also find at votestevediamond.com a page for volunteering if you want to sign up for my newsletter, or sign up to do some things for the campaign, volunteer. You can do that with a form on that page. And let me say a few words about the plans going forward, since everything, obviously there's no campaign functions going on other than online, other than in the virtual world or on the phone. One of the initiatives that I'm going to start soon is phone banking and text banking. So if you want to do some phoning and or texting on behalf of the campaign, I'll be starting that up very soon. Just check the box that says phone banking when you fill out the volunteer form, and I will be in touch.
Okay, we've got a bunch of additional questions. One of them comes from Steve and Christina, and they're inquiring about, how do you feel about gun shows and background checks at the Pima County Fairgrounds?
I would like to see universal background checks instituted. I think it can be a somewhat complicated issue. I talked to someone, a constituent the other day, who was telling me that if you do universal background checks, it's really the equivalent of universal registration, and then you're just encouraging under the table transactions between private parties. And I'm not sure I agree with that standpoint. I think that what we can do, we should do to control gun sales and to make sure that they are only sold to responsible individuals. So I would lobby the um, the fair people to make that happen. You know, what's happening at the gun show is, and at the county fair for that matter, I think, is that there are reputable gun dealers at the gun show in the designated area, and then there are under the table deals that are made in the parking lot. And the those who organize it are those who permit that to happen, and I for one don't think it ought to be happening.
All right. Got another question here. Let me just look at the list. Steve, what power would you have on the board to transition the county's transportation and energy generation to carbon neutral sources? And can you commit to setting an aggressive timeline targets for achieving those goals?
I would certainly commit to placing those goals high on the priority list. I am not sure everything that can be done. I think that the county is already doing some things in terms of its building infrastructure, converting to solar power. As for the transportation, though, I haven't even heard any talk about anything like all electric fleets. There may very well be talk, but if there is, I haven't heard it. So I have to say I definitely support the idea, but I don't know enough about it to know how it's going to be accomplished.
Okay, we have a question from Carolyn. Carolyn would like to know, when is the next Pima County Board of Supervisors meeting to appoint a successor for Supervisor Richard Elias?
I don't know. I haven't seen any announcement about that. Presumably, I mean, my guess is that they will meet this week, although to some extent they're constrained by state open meeting laws, which require meetings to be announced to the public so many days in advance of the meeting, and they require public access. So it may not be until the regular meeting next week that they're able to do that. So I don't know. I look forward to finding out along with everyone else.
All right. Got a question here from Lillian. Lillian asks, Tucson property taxes are used to fund PAYGO, but not a dime will be used to repair Tucson roads. Will you make sure that some PAYGO money goes to repairing Tucson's roads?
Yeah, I know. There's been a lot of discussion between city and county officials about that, and I don't really know what stage those talks are at. Some of the city council people have been very vociferous about saying that this is not a fair or a desirable way of doing things because of the factor that you mentioned, that the city wouldn't be receiving any of these funds. So yeah, I think that's the right idea, that some of it should go to the city, but I don't know how that's going to happen. I don't know whether they're going to have to. Probably they're going to have to rescind the original PAYGO resolution and come up with a new one that includes the city. And I believe I would be in favor of that. Yes.
All right. A couple more questions here. Mike has a question, and he wants to know, what are your ideas to reduce the county jail populations while at the same time decreasing recidivism?
Yeah, that's another issue that I wasn't able to get to today, but it's near and dear to my heart, and I thank you for asking that. I think we seriously need criminal justice reform in a big way here in this county. After 20-some years of Barbara LaWall as county attorney, we are in a position where there is way too much prosecution of minor offenses particularly drug possession, and that just has to stop. The Board of Supervisors has limited authority to, some say no authority to influence what the county attorney does. So it's very important that we elect a new progressive county attorney this year. Personally, my support goes to Laura Conover. I believe she is the one who will reform that office and who will dramatically reduce the prosecutions of minor drug offenses and replace them. You know, you mentioned recidivism. There are some pilot projects that have been going on to enter people into drug users into treatment plans rather than jailing them. And the trouble with those projects is they're very small scale. And again, I think it's going to be up to the county attorney, whoever is elected for next year, to expand those treatment programs, those counseling programs, and to dramatically reduce prosecutions for drug possession offenses.
Okay, we've got a question from Amy, and she says, Steve, would you please tell us your stance on the outlawed dirty money initiative? It's a citizens initiative, and it was paused last week, but it's not canceled due to the coronavirus. It's just on pause. So what do you think about the initiative?
I support that initiative completely. I think money in politics should be totally transparent. And yeah, my understanding is the only thing that was paused was collecting signatures, which obviously is not something that is desirable to be done in public these days. And I don't know whether the state's going to do anything to accommodate this situation. Obviously, it cuts down on the time that signatures could be collected for any state initiatives and city initiatives too, for that matter. The longer we are sheltering in place, the more difficult that's going to be. But yes, I support that initiative completely.
All right, I've got a practical question here from Carolyn. Carolyn would like to know, how will you overcome the general election, the 7,500 voter edge that Republicans have over Democrats in your district, especially since you're challenging an incumbent Republican?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. And one thing is, if you look at the voter registration numbers, they've been changing pretty regularly. That 7,500 number was well over 10,000 just a few months ago. And so at that rate, now I don't think it's going to continue to change at quite that rate, but if it did, it would be pretty close to a toss-up by election day. That's one thing. That's one factor. Another factor is that I think there is going to be a lot of voter enthusiasm on the part of Democrats this November, and maybe not so much on the part of Republicans. I'm hoping that's going to be the case. And another thing is that I expect to have a strong campaign organization myself, and I know that there are dozens of out-of-state and in-state organizations here in Arizona who are going to be helping get out the Democratic vote. There is huge national interest in Arizona this year as being a swing state. Now, I'm sure Republicans will be spending money here as well, but the Mark Kelly campaign is being very successful, and they are the ones who are running the Arizona Democratic coordinated campaign this year. So they will be coordinating with other campaigns, other Democratic campaigns up and down the ballot. And there are out-of-state organizations who are flying in literally thousands of volunteers to work in Arizona. They're flying them in from safe districts in California and elsewhere. So I really anticipate a great deal of Democratic enthusiasm this year. So that's the other factor. Plus, I think that I can appeal to moderate independents and maybe even to some moderate Republicans. You know, some of them got quite a shock after 2016 when they saw the differences between Steve Christie, the current incumbent, and Ray Carroll, the previous incumbent. Ray was a moderate Republican. He was staunchly opposed, for example, to the Rosemont Mine. And Steve Christie is anything but a moderate Republican. He's a business-loving, Trump-loving person through and through, and he strongly supports the Rosemont Mine, for example. So they, even Republicans in the district, didn't quite get what they thought they were getting, I think. And some of them may be inclined to vote for me. In fact, if anyone knows a Republican or a few Republicans in the district who might be feeling that way, I'm looking to organize a Republicans for Steve Diamond club. And I think that would be a brilliant way of helping to ensure that outcome. And of course, another way, you know, Steve Christie is independently wealthy. He sold his car dealerships, and I'm certainly not. So that's why I appreciate every donation that comes in, because it will take money as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time. I want to encourage everybody who would like to support Steve, go to votestevediamond.com, and his email address is here, and he's basically saying, what can I do for you? So if you would like to get involved with Steve and, you know, get rid of a really awful incumbent, this is how you do it. And with that, Steve, do you have a parting comment for us? And then after that, we're out of questions, so we'll end the webinar.
Well, my only parting comment is thank you very much. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, DGT board, and thanks to everyone who has attended and who has listened through all of this. I hope it was both informative and entertaining. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Steve, very much for your time. Wish you all the best in your campaign. And with that, we're going to conclude the webinar. So see you next time. Bye-bye.